Demonstration of the archive log behavior in RAC. Remember, in RAC you have multiple nodes. Each node has one database instance, and each database instance is its own redo thread. So here I have two nodes, node 1 and node 2. Each instance has its own thread. So this is thread 1 in node 1 and thread 2 in node 2. And for this demonstration I've created a simple script which does some transactions, commits, and then forces a log switch. So yes, it's a loop and commits and then a log switch. So let me just update this loop again, so improve on the transaction size. Ability causing more commits. Okay, so now similarly on the other instance also I have similarly a loop, table Y here and table X here. So I'm going to run this transaction from node 1 . Okay, so node 1 is instance 1 redo thread 1. So that's where I'm doing the transactions, and you can see thread 1 has advanced to 127 is the current sequence and 126 is the last archive. So this is 126 is the last archived from thread 1, 85 is the last archive from thread 2, which you can see here. Okay, it's already advanced to 86, but let's see. As far as this, when the script ran, it was 85. This is the current database SCN, and this is the last SCN in the corresponding sequence. I'll show you that script again. So first I do a drop table, create a table, and run multiple inserts in a loop, each insert causing a commit. So I'm incrementing the SCNs very rapidly. Then here I do a switch log file and then I sleep. The difference between a switch log file and archive log currently is the switch log file can run in both archive log and no archive log databases, while archive log run can only run when your database is in archive log mode. Okay. The other difference is switch log file will cause an archive log generation if it's archive log mode, but the command will return immediately to you. And when you do an auto system archive log current, the command does not return until the archive log is generated. So in an archive log database, it's always a good idea to use the archive log current command rather than switch log file. But here for demonstration purposes, I'm showing a switch log file because this command will run in both archive and no archive log database. And even in a no archive log database, you will still have redo generation and the sequence is being incremented. So I just put in a sleep after the switch log file to capture the actual generation of the archive log into the RedoLog archive log view, and then present it in this query. So I show the current SCN, that's this one, and for each thread I have two instances there. So I have two threads, what is the last sequence and what is the last SCN in that sequence. Remember, in RAC database, the two threads or the 4 threads or the 8 threads, depending how many instances you have, do not have to be at the same sequence number, but they should be close in terms of SCNs. Okay, so here you can see that they're close in terms of SCNs. So I'll run this script one more time. Okay, so this got advanced. 127 is being archived. 86 is still the last archive here in thread 2, and so you can see some gap between the SCNs. Now I'm going to run the same script from thread 2 here. It's not exactly the same script, but it's a similar script. Okay, what you see here is thread 1 is slightly ahead of thread 2 in terms of last SCN or last change number. So when I run the transactions command in thread 2, that is instance 2, I can see that 87 has been archived. So you can see here 87 has been archived and 127 has also advanced to 128. So it does cause a switch in the other instance. and you can see the gap here was different, and here both have advanced, and the gap here is very close. They're very close. So what happened was, instance 2, when it runs transactions, it found that instance it has advanced beyond instance 1 by a significant number because of this large loop here. So it kicked off archival of instance 1, so that the SCN in instance 1, the SCN in instance 1 thread is close to instance 2 thread, while here instance 1 was ahead. Now they are very close to each other. Instance 2 is ahead. Let me run this again. So from 120 to 87, you can see both will have advanced to 129 and maybe 88. Okay, 129, 88, and the gap is still very small between the two. So you can see it forced a log switch here. Okay, and it forced a log switch here. So the gap between the two threads has narrowed. Instance 1 is idle in this case. There is no transactions happening in instance 1. I have not done anything in instance 1 recently, but instance 2 has been running transactions, so it has forced the SCN to be incremented for thread 1 and the archive log to be generated, so that the thread 1 redo logs are also being archived. This is very advantageous because when you run a backup, you know that the thread 1 is not far behind thread 2. So when you run a backup, an RMAN backup, whether you run it from node 1, node 2, node 3, or from the standby, the SCNs in the thread 1 are close to SCNs in thread 2. If you have multiple threads, that is multiple instances, they are all very close to each other. So let me just run this here. Now in this case, this is not advancing much. So here it is only forcing a log switch. You can see here 88 was the last sequence archived from thread 2, and still 88, and the gap has suddenly widened from thread 1 to thread 2. So if I were to run some transactions from thread 2 again, remember thread 1 is at 130 and thread 2 was at 88. Now it has caused a switch and archival of thread 1 to 131, and 88 has gone to 89 because thread 2 is also archived, and the gap has narrowed down. You can see here what is the gap. Let me just show you the gap here first. Instance 1 was ahead of instance 2. Oops, sorry. So remember, the gap is in terms of change numbers, SCNs, not in terms of sequence numbers. Sequence numbers do not matter. There's a gap of 1817 here, but now you can see that instance 2 has actually advanced, and there's a very small gap. So if you have a RAC database and multiple instances running with different transaction volumes, what Oracle does is, if there is a database that is idle with smaller transaction rate, it will force a log switch and archival of the redo thread from that instance, so that the SCNs in the redo logs or the archive logs are close to the active SCNs of the other instances. It will ensure that there is never a large gap between the instances. Like here, there was a much larger gap, 1817. Of course, in the real world, the gap could be a million SCNs. But now, when I forced a log switch on thread 2, remember your command here is only to do a local log switch. Okay, let me just. The command here is only to do a local log switch. Okay, an archival of the file. While here the command is here to do a switch log file only. Okay. But whenever it says, okay, I'm doing a archival, let me it will check the SCN in the other threads and also force a switch for them. Let me just modify the script on node 2, and instead of archive log current I'll just change to switch log file. And then I'll run the script again. So remember, this was the gap, only 6 change numbers between instance 2 being ahead of instance 1. So I'm going to run this script again from node 2, and earlier it was at 131 and 89 last archived, 131 and 90 last archived, so the gap has slightly increased. Then I will run this again. So now you can see it has forced a switch. I'm not doing anything from node 1, no activity from node 1, but when I ran transactions against node 2, it has forced a switch and the gap has narrowed again. So Oracle will always keep checking the gaps. 6, 6, 8. Okay, now there is a slight gap of 10, but earlier there is a gap of let's see this one. So what Oracle will always do is, once the gap has widened, like here we saw a gap of 1817, here we saw there's a gap of 724, and once the gap widens, when it does a archival from one node, it will also archive the RedoLogs of the thread of the other node. So to ensure that the gap is always very narrow, here the gap of 10 only between the SCNs of the two instances, while earlier the gap was 74 between the SCNs of the two instances. So whether you use a switch log file command or you use archive log command, when the archiver wants to do an archive, it will verify the SCNs and force a log switch and a archival of the inactive thread, inactive instance, so that your threads have the close SCNs. When you do a backup of the archive logs, they are close to each other. So even if you have a 4 node RAC instance and one node is idle all the time, you just use it for failover, or you just use it for a report that runs only once a day, the SCNs of the thread of that instance will be getting incremented when the other 3 instances are active. So the threads of that idle instance will also be archived, that is the RedoLogs of that thread will also be archived periodically, automatically, even though you do not explicitly run an archive log command on that idle instance.